It was supposed to be a simple drive. Lieutenant General Raymond Cole had driven this route dozens of times before, heading south on Interstate 95 through Virginia to visit his mother. At 62 years old, Raymond had spent nearly 3 decades serving his country, rising through the ranks to become one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. He had commanded troops in multiple theaters of war, advised presidents, and earned more medals than he could count. But on this particular Saturday afternoon in late spring, he wore nothing that would identify him as anything other than an ordinary citizen. A plain gray polo shirt, comfortable jeans, and running shoes. His military uniform stayed packed in his closet at home in Maryland. The day had started perfectly. Raymond left his house early, stopping at a local coffee shop where he grabbed his usual order, black coffee and a blueberry muffin. He chatted briefly with the barista about the weather, paid with exact change, and headed to his car. The drive would take about 2 hours, and he planned to spend the weekend helping his 87-year-old mother with some repairs around her house. She had been complaining about a leaky faucet and some loose deck boards, and Raymond looked forward to the simple manual labor. After weeks of tense meetings at the Pentagon, the idea of working with his hands felt refreshing. As he crossed into the small town of Riverside, Virginia, Raymond slowed down, respecting the reduced speed limit. The town looked like so many others along this stretch of highway. A main street lined with family-owned shops, a few chain restaurants, and residential neighborhoods with modest homes and well-kept lawns. Children played in front yards and people washed their cars in driveways. It seemed peaceful, almost sleepy in the afternoon sun. Raymond approached a red traffic light and came to a complete stop. He glanced in his rearview mirror and noticed a police cruiser pull up behind him. The officer appeared to be alone in the vehicle. Raymond thought nothing of it. He had been pulled over maybe twice in his entire life, both times for minor speeding tickets decades ago. He always kept his registration current, his inspection sticker was valid, and he had been driving carefully. When the light turned green, he accelerated smoothly and continued down the main road. But the police cruiser stayed behind him. Raymond noticed it following him through the next intersection, then the next. He checked his speedometer. He was going exactly 30 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. His turn signal worked fine. His brake lights were new. There was absolutely no reason for concern, yet something in the back of his mind, honed by years of military experience, told him to pay attention. Then the lights came on. Red and blue flashed in his mirror, and Raymond's heart sank slightly. He immediately put on his right turn signal and began looking for a safe place to pull over. He spotted a quiet side street and turned onto it, pulling his sedan to the curb in front of a residential area. He put the car in park, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock, exactly as he had taught his own children to do during traffic stops. Raymond watched in his side mirror as the officer stepped out of the cruiser. The man appeared to be in his 40s with a stocky build and a stern expression that was visible even from a distance. He wore the standard dark blue uniform of the Riverside Police Department and moved with a certain swagger that Raymond recognized, confidence bordering on aggression. As the officer approached the driver's side window, Raymond noticed the man's hand resting on his service weapon. Though it remained holstered, Raymond rolled down his window completely, keeping his hands visible. "Good afternoon, officer," he said calmly. The officer didn't return the greeting. Instead, he leaned down slightly and stared at Raymond with cold eyes. "License and registration, now." The tone immediately struck Raymond as off. There was no explanation for the stop, no polite introduction, just a harsh command. But Raymond had been through enough in his life to know when to comply without question. "Yes, sir. My license is in my wallet in my back right pocket, and my registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them slowly. I didn't ask for an explanation. Just do it," the officer snapped. Raymond slowly reached for his wallet, pulling it out with 2 fingers. He extracted his driver's license and placed it on the dashboard. Then he leaned toward the glove compartment, opening it carefully to retrieve his registration and insurance card. As he did, the officer suddenly stepped back and his hand moved to his weapon. "What are you doing?" "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer shouted. Raymond froze, his hand still extended toward the glove compartment. "I'm getting my registration, officer. You just asked for it. Don't talk back to me." The officer's voice had risen in volume and aggression. You think you're smart? You think you can just do whatever you want? Raymond felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't right. This wasn't how traffic stops worked. He had done nothing wrong, said nothing disrespectful. He slowly withdrew his hand, holding the registration and insurance card, and placed them on the dashboard next to his license. Here are my documents, officer. The officer snatched them up but barely glanced at them. Instead, he stared at Raymond with open hostility. What are you doing in this neighborhood? I'm passing through on my way to see my mother, Raymond answered, keeping his voice steady and respectful. Sure you are, the officer said with a sneer. Then he said something that made Raymond's blood run cold, a racial slur spoken casually as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The officer continued, We don't need your kind causing trouble around here. I've seen plenty like you, and I know what you're up to. Raymond couldn't believe what he was hearing. In all his years of service representing his country around the world, he had faced many challenges. But this, being insulted and profiled on a quiet street in America, felt surreal and deeply wrong. Officer, I assure you I'm not causing any trouble, Raymond said, fighting to keep his voice calm. I'm just driving through. Step out of the vehicle, the officer commanded. May I ask why I'm being asked to step out? Because I said so. The officer's hand was now fully on his weapon. Step out now or this is going to get a lot worse for you. Raymond's military training kicked in. He assessed the situation rapidly. The officer was clearly hostile and unpredictable. Arguing would only escalate things. His best option was to comply and hope that reason would prevail once the situation calmed down. He slowly opened his door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible at all times. But the officer wasn't satisfied. Turn around.
Hands on the vehicle.
Raymond did as instructed, placing his palms flat on the roof of his car. The metal was hot from the afternoon sun, burning his skin slightly, but he didn't move. Behind him, he could hear the officer moving closer, and then he felt rough hands patting him down aggressively, checking for weapons. Officer, there's no need for this, Raymond said quietly. I have identification that shows, shut up, the officer barked. Then, incredibly, Raymond heard the sound he had heard countless times on battlefields but never thought he would hear on an American street directed at him, the metallic slide of a gun being drawn from its holster. Don't. You move, the officer said, his voice low and threatening. Don't you dare move or I swear I'll make sure you regret it. Raymond felt the presence of the weapon behind him, and his heart pounded in his chest. This couldn't be happening, not here, not like this. Raymond stood completely still, his hands pressed against the hot metal of his car, feeling the presence of the gun behind him. Every instinct from his military training told him to assess threats and respond appropriately, but this situation defied all logic. He was a 3-star general in the United States Army, being held at gunpoint by a local police officer on a quiet suburban street for no apparent reason other than the color of his skin. Officer, Raymond said slowly, keeping his voice as calm as possible. I need you to understand something. I am Lieutenant General Raymond Cole of the United States Army. My military identification is in my wallet on the dashboard. If you would just look at it. Oh, you're a general now? The officer laughed, a harsh mocking sound. Right, and I'm the president. You people always got some story, don't you? He used another racial slur, spitting the word with venom. Raymond closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had commanded thousands of soldiers, negotiated with foreign dignitaries, and briefed members of Congress. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal by someone who refused to even look at evidence of his identity. I'm telling you the truth. Please just check my identification. Get on the ground, the officer commanded. On your knees now. Officer, this is now. The officer's voice rose to a shout, and Raymond felt the barrel of the gun press against his back. Raymond complied, slowly lowering himself to his knees on the hot pavement. Small pieces of gravel dug into his kneecaps through his jeans. He kept his hands raised, visible, non-threatening. This was a nightmare, but it was real, and he knew that any sudden movement could be interpreted as resistance. He had seen too many news stories about encounters like this going tragically wrong. The officer moved around to face him, keeping the weapon pointed at Raymond's chest. You think you can just drive through our town like you own the place? You think you're better than us? I don't think that at all, Raymond said quietly. I'm just trying to visit my mother. Sure you are. That's what they all say. The officer's finger rested near the trigger, and Raymond could see the man's hand trembling slightly. Whether from anger or adrenaline, he couldn't tell. Either way, it made the situation even more dangerous. From the corner of his eye, Raymond noticed movement on a nearby porch. An elderly woman had stepped outside, holding what looked like a phone. She stood about 30 yards away, her face showing clear concern and confusion as she watched the scene unfold. Raymond hoped desperately that she was calling for help, for someone who could bring sanity to this situation. The officer noticed her too and shouted, "Ma'am, go back inside. This is police business." The woman didn't move. Instead, she called out, "What's going on? Why do you have that man on his knees?" "I said go inside," the officer yelled. "This doesn't concern you." But the woman, whose name was Helen Nguyen, didn't go inside. She had lived in Riverside for 40 years, raised 3 children there, and buried her husband in the town cemetery 5 years ago. She knew right from wrong, and what she was witnessing looked very wrong. She raised her phone higher, making it clear she was recording. This seemed to enrage the officer further. "You want to be arrested too, lady? For interfering with an officer?" "I'm not interfering," Helen called back firmly. "I'm just standing on my own property, watching what's happening on my street." Raymond remained silent, afraid that any interaction might escalate things further. The sun beat down on his head and sweat began to trickle down his back. His knees ached against the hard pavement. He thought about his mother waiting for him to arrive. She would worry when he didn't show up on time. He thought about his wife, who was home believing her husband was on a routine visit to his childhood home. He thought about his children, now adults with families of their own, and how they would feel knowing their father had been treated this way. The sound of another police siren broke through his thoughts. A second cruiser pulled up behind the first one, and Raymond felt a small surge of hope. Perhaps this new officer would be reasonable, would look at the situation objectively and realize that something was very wrong here. A female officer stepped out of the second vehicle. She appeared younger than the first officer, perhaps in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She approached cautiously, taking in the scene. A man on his knees, a weapon drawn, a resident recording from her porch. "What's the situation, Walsh?" she asked the first officer. So his name was Walsh. Raymond filed that information away. "Suspicious person, Chen," Walsh replied, not taking his eyes off Raymond. "Pulled him over for erratic driving and he's been non-compliant and aggressive." Raymond's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. None of that was true. His driving had been perfect and he had complied with every command, no matter how unreasonable. Officer Chen walked closer, and her eyes fell on Raymond's car. Through the open door, she could see the documents on the dashboard. She moved to examine them, picking up the driver's license and studying it carefully. Her expression changed, and she glanced back at Raymond with a look that seemed almost apologetic. "Walsh," she said quietly, "this ID says he's a lieutenant general in the U.S. Army." "Yeah, right," Walsh scoffed. "Probably fake. These people get fake IDs all the time." "It looks legitimate to me," Chen insisted. "And there's a military ID card here too. This is serious. I know what I'm doing, Chen. This is my stop, my call. You're just backup." But Officer Chen didn't back down. She had been on the force for 6 years and had seen her share of tense situations. But she had also been trained to recognize when things were going off the rails. "Walsh, I really think we need to verify this. If this man is who he says he is, he's not." Walsh interrupted. "Look at him. Does he look like a general to you?" The racist implication was clear, and Officer Chen felt her stomach turn. She had heard rumors about Walsh, whispers in the break room about complaints that had been filed and somehow disappeared. She had always hoped they weren't true, but now she was seeing it firsthand. Raymond finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat. "Officer Chen, thank you for at least looking at my identification. I am Lieutenant General Raymond Cole. I have served this country for 28 years. My command can be reached through the Pentagon. I am asking you as a fellow servant of the public to help resolve this situation peacefully." His words were measured, dignified, and impossible to ignore. Officer Chen looked at Walsh, then back at Raymond. "Walsh, put your weapon away. Let's handle this properly. Are you questioning me?" Walsh's face reddened with anger. "You're just a Sergeant, Chen. I don't take orders from you." I'm not giving you an order. I'm making a strong suggestion based on what I'm seeing here. She gestured to Helen, still recording from her porch. We have a witness. We have documentation. We need to verify his identity before this goes any further. Walsh hesitated, and for a moment Raymond thought reason might prevail. But then Walsh's pride seemed to take over. Fine, call it in. But he stays right where he is until we know for sure. And if this turns out to be bogus, I'm charging him with impersonating an officer and whatever else I can think of. Officer Chen returned to her cruiser and got on the radio. Raymond could hear her speaking in low tones, giving his name and identification numbers. While they waited, Walsh kept his weapon drawn, though he lowered it slightly, no longer pointing it directly at Raymond's chest. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one feeling like an hour. Helen remained on her porch, her phone still recording. A few other neighbors had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They stood in small clusters, watching and whispering. Some of them pulled out their own phones and began recording as well. Officer Chen returned, and her face had gone pale. Walsh, we need to talk privately. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here, Walsh replied stubbornly. Chen lowered her voice, but Raymond could still hear her. I just spoke with dispatch, who contacted the Pentagon. This man is exactly who he says he is. He's a 3-star general, Walsh. You just pulled over and held at gunpoint one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military. The color drained from Walsh's face, but he didn't lower his weapon completely. Helen Nguyen's hands shook as she held her phone, but she kept it steady, making sure every moment was captured. She had seen enough. After recording for several minutes, she pulled up her social media app and began uploading the video with a simple caption. This is happening right now on Oak Street in Riverside. A police officer has his gun drawn on an unarmed man who has done nothing wrong. This needs to be seen. Within seconds of posting, the video began spreading. Helen's daughter, who lived 2 states away, saw it first and immediately shared it with her network. Then her friends shared it. And their friends. The video moved through social media like wildfire, jumping from platform to platform. People who saw the footage were stunned by what they witnessed. The obvious hostility, the drawn weapon, the man on his knees maintaining remarkable composure. Back on Oak Street, Walsh finally holstered his weapon, but his face had gone from pale to red. Officer Chen stood nearby, her radio crackling with increasingly urgent messages. Dispatch had confirmed Raymond's identity through multiple channels, and now they were receiving calls from people who had seen the video online. The situation was spiraling beyond their control. Sir, you can stand up now, Officer Chen said to Raymond, her voice apologetic and embarrassed. Raymond slowly rose to his feet, his knees stiff and aching from kneeling on the hot pavement. He brushed the dirt and small stones from his jeans, maintaining his dignity despite everything. He looked directly at Walsh, whose eyes now avoided his gaze. Officer Walsh, Raymond said calmly, I told you who I was. I showed you my identification. I complied with every order you gave me, even when those orders were unreasonable and unjustified. And still you chose to treat me like a criminal. Walsh opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since the encounter began, he seemed at a loss for words. Officer Chen stepped forward. General Cole, I cannot apologize enough for what has happened here. This should never have occurred. We will be filing a full report, and I assure you this will be investigated. It better be, Raymond replied, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Because what happened here today wasn't just a mistake. It was a violation of my rights, my dignity, and everything I have spent my life defending. Another siren approached, this one louder and more urgent. A third vehicle pulled up, this one unmarked. A man in his 50s stepped out wearing a white shirt, tie, and a badge clipped to his belt. His expression was grim as he took in the scene. The crowd of neighbors, the phones recording, and Raymond Cole standing there covered in dust and sweat. I'm Chief Davidson, the man said, walking directly to Raymond. General Cole, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what has occurred. I received multiple calls about this incident, including one directly from the Pentagon. Raymond nodded slowly. The Pentagon called you? Yes, sir. Approximately 10 minutes ago. They wanted to know why one of their 3-star generals was being detained by my department without cause. Chief Davidson's jaw tightened as he glanced at Walsh. And frankly, I want to know the same thing. Helen approached from her porch, her phone still in hand. Chief Davidson, I recorded the entire incident. That officer, She pointed at Walsh. Used terrible language, racial slurs, multiple times. He drew his weapon when this gentleman was completely cooperative. It was disgraceful. "Ma'am, I'll need a copy of that recording," the chief said. "You'll have it," Helen replied firmly, "and so will everyone else. I already posted it online." The chief's expression darkened. He turned to Walsh. "Officer Walsh, you are suspended effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon, now." Walsh's face went from red to white. "Chief, I was just doing my job. I had reasonable suspicion." "Reasonable suspicion of what?" The chief's voice rose. "General Cole was driving through town, obeying all traffic laws. You pulled him over without cause, subjected him to verbal abuse, and drew your weapon on an unarmed man who was cooperating fully. And all of this while using language that violates not only department policy, but basic human decency." Walsh fumbled with his badge, unclipping it from his uniform with shaking hands. He surrendered his weapon as well, his face a mixture of anger and fear. Without another word, he walked to his cruiser and drove away, leaving the scene in tense silence. Chief Davidson turned back to Raymond. "General, could you please accompany me to the station? Not under arrest," he added quickly. "But we need to document everything that happened here. Get your official statement, and I want to personally ensure that this is handled correctly." Raymond considered this for a moment. His mother was still waiting for him, unaware of what had transpired. But he knew this couldn't be swept under the rug. "I'll come to the station, but I need to make a phone call first." "Of course, sir. Take all the time you need." Raymond retrieved his phone from his car and called his mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. "Raymond? Where are you, honey? I've been watching for your car." "Mom, I'm going to be a bit late. Something happened, but I'm okay. I promise I'll explain everything when I see you." Her tone shifted to concern. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm not hurt. Just delayed. I'll be there in a few hours." After reassuring his mother and ending the call, Raymond made another call, this one to his wife, Catherine. He explained the situation briefly, and he could hear the shock and anger in her voice. "Raymond, this is unacceptable. You could have been killed." "I know," he said quietly. "But I wasn't. And now we need to make sure this means something, that it leads to change." At the police station, Raymond spent over 2 hours giving his statement. He recounted every detail: the initial stop, Walsh's hostile demeanor, the racial slurs, the drawn weapon, his time on his knees on the hot pavement. Officer Chen gave her statement as well, confirming Raymond's account and adding that she had attempted to de-escalate the situation, but Walsh had refused to listen. While Raymond was at the station, the video from Helen's phone had gone viral. Major news networks picked it up and it began appearing on evening broadcasts. Military news sites ran the story with headlines expressing outrage. Social media exploded with reactions from people across the country: veterans, active duty service members, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens who were horrified by what they saw. By the time Raymond left the police station, reporters had gathered outside. They called out questions as he walked to his car with Chief Davidson at his side. "General Cole, how do you feel about what happened today?" "General, will you be pressing charges? What do you want to see happen to the officer involved?" Raymond paused and turned to face the cameras. He knew that what he said now would be heard by millions. He chose his words carefully. "Today, I experienced something that far too many people in this country experience regularly. I was profiled, threatened, and dehumanized by someone sworn to protect and serve. The only difference between my situation and countless others is that I hold a rank that gave me credibility when I stated my identity. But here's the truth: my rank shouldn't matter. Every person, regardless of their position, race, or background, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect by law enforcement. What happened to me today was wrong, and I intend to use whatever influence I have to ensure it leads to meaningful change." The cameras flashed as reporters scribbled notes. Raymond didn't take questions. He simply got in his car and drove away, heading south toward his mother's house. When he finally arrived, nearly 5 hours late, his mother was waiting on the porch. She took one look at his face and opened her arms. Raymond hugged her tightly, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. "I saw the news," she said softly. "My son, my brave son, you could have been killed. But I wasn't, Mama. I'm here. That evening, as Raymond sat in his mother's kitchen drinking tea, his phone rang constantly. Calls from military colleagues, from friends, from officials wanting to express their support and outrage. The Pentagon issued a formal statement condemning the incident and calling for a thorough investigation. The governor of Virginia called personally to apologize. But the call that surprised Raymond most came from a private number. When he answered, a familiar voice spoke. "General Cole, this is Senator Williams. I've been following the news about your encounter today, and I want you to know that I'm appalled by what happened. I'm calling to ask if you would be willing to testify before Congress about this incident and about the broader issues of police reform and accountability." Raymond sat quietly for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "Senator, I'll do whatever is necessary to make sure this leads to real change." That night, Raymond lay awake in his childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling. He thought about all the years he had served his country, all the sacrifices he had made. And he thought about Officer Walsh, whose hatred and prejudice had been so strong that even a military uniform couldn't have changed his actions. The saddest part was knowing that if he had been wearing his uniform, Walsh probably would have treated him with respect, not because of who Raymond was as a person, but because of the rank and symbols. The morning after the incident, Raymond woke to find that the story had become national news. Every major network led with it. The headlines varied slightly, but they all captured the same shocking reality. A decorated military general had been held at gunpoint by a police officer for no reason other than driving through a small Virginia town. The video Helen had recorded had been viewed millions of times. News analysts discussed it. Radio hosts debated it. Social media was flooded with reactions ranging from outrage to heartbreak. Raymond's phone continued ringing throughout the morning. His commanding officers at the Pentagon called to check on him and express their support. Fellow generals, some of whom he had served with in combat zones across the world, reached out to share their anger and solidarity. But perhaps most moving were the calls from ordinary soldiers, young men and women who had served under his command or who simply knew of his reputation, telling him how much his response to the situation had inspired them. Meanwhile, in Riverside, the police department was in crisis mode. Chief Davidson had barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing files and body cam footage. What he discovered made him feel sick to his stomach. Officer Walsh's file contained 17 formal complaints over his 15-year career. 17 complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, inappropriate language, and aggressive behavior during routine stops. Some had been investigated, but most had been dismissed with minimal consequences. A few resulted in brief suspensions or mandatory training, but Walsh had always been allowed to return to duty. The chief called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. Around the conference table sat sergeants, lieutenants, and the department's internal affairs investigator. The atmosphere was tense. "I want to know how this happened," Davidson said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "How did an officer with 17 complaints continue to patrol our streets? Who signed off on these investigations? Who decided that a pattern of behavior like this was acceptable?" The internal affairs investigator, a man named Frank Peterson, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Chief, each complaint was handled according to protocol at the time. We found insufficient evidence in most cases." "Insufficient evidence?" Davidson interrupted. "Or insufficient will to actually hold someone accountable?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew the answer to that question. For years, the department had operated under a culture where officers protected each other, where complaints from citizens were viewed with skepticism, and where the easiest path was to give officers the benefit of the doubt and move on. "That ends today," Davidson continued. "I'm ordering a complete review of Walsh's entire history. Every stop he made, every complaint filed, every report he wrote. I want to know if there are other victims out there who were too afraid to come forward, or whose complaints were buried." Within hours of that meeting, the state police announced they would be conducting an independent investigation. The FBI's Civil Rights Division also opened a case, noting that the incident potentially violated federal laws protecting citizens from abuse of authority based on race. And the district attorney, a woman named Victoria Torres who had prosecuted dozens of cases in her 12-year career, announced that she would personally be reviewing the evidence to determine what criminal charges to file. Officer Walsh, meanwhile, had hired a lawyer. His attorney, Gerald Stevens, was known for defending police officers in misconduct cases. Stevens immediately began trying to shape the narrative, giving interviews where he suggested that Walsh had simply been doing his job and that the situation had been blown out of proportion by social media. Officer Walsh conducted a routine traffic stop based on reasonable suspicion, Stevens told reporters outside his office. He followed department protocols and ensured his own safety during an uncertain situation. The fact that the driver turned out to be a high-ranking military officer doesn't change the fact that Officer Walsh acted appropriately, given the information he had at the time. But Stevens' attempts at damage control crumbled almost immediately. More videos emerged. Cell phone footage from neighbors showed different angles of the incident, and they all told the same story: an unarmed, cooperative man being threatened and humiliated. The audio captured Walsh's repeated use of racial slurs, which couldn't be explained away or justified. And then came the testimonies. One by one, citizens of Riverside and surrounding towns began coming forward with their own stories about Officer Walsh. A black businessman described being pulled over 3 times in 1 month for minor infractions, each time subjected to aggressive questioning and searches. A Hispanic family recounted how Walsh had questioned their immigration status during a routine fender bender, despite all of them being American citizens. A young Asian American college student told reporters how Walsh had accused her of stealing her own car and made her wait in handcuffs for over an hour until her parents could bring documentation proving ownership. The pattern was undeniable. Walsh had spent years targeting people of color, using his badge and authority to intimidate and harass, and the department had allowed it to continue. The local police union initially released a statement supporting Walsh, calling for patience and warning against rushing to judgment. But as more evidence emerged and public pressure mounted, even the union had to distance itself from him. The union president issued a revised statement saying that while they supported officers who acted properly, they could not defend behavior that violated the law and department policies. 3 days after the incident, Officer Walsh was fired. The decision came from an emergency session of the town council, which voted unanimously to terminate his employment. Chief Davidson personally delivered the news, and while Walsh tried to defend himself, there was nothing left to say. The evidence was overwhelming, but termination was just the beginning. District Attorney Torres moved swiftly to file criminal charges. Walsh was arrested at his home on a Thursday morning, just 5 days after he had pulled Raymond over. The charges were serious: assault with a deadly weapon, civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and official misconduct. If convicted on all counts, he faced up to 15 years in prison. The arrest was covered live by news helicopters. Images of Walsh, now in civilian clothes with his hands cuffed behind his back, being led to a police car were broadcast across the country. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had put so many people in handcuffs unjustly was now experiencing the same treatment. Raymond watched the news coverage from his Pentagon office, where he had returned to duty. He felt no satisfaction in seeing Walsh arrested, only a deep sadness that it had come to this. How many lives had Walsh damaged over the years? How many people had he traumatized? And how many of them had never received justice because they didn't have the rank, the platform, or the credibility that Raymond possessed? The Pentagon had been supportive beyond Raymond's expectations. The Secretary of Defense had called him personally, and there had been discussions about what role Raymond might play in addressing these broader issues. But Raymond had also faced questions from reporters about whether he would sue the department civilly. His answer had been consistent. His focus wasn't on personal compensation but on systemic change. Officer Chen, who had tried to intervene during the incident, was interviewed extensively by investigators. Her testimony was crucial, as she confirmed every detail of Raymond's account and acknowledged that she had been aware of Walsh's reputation but hadn't known how to address it effectively. She spoke candidly about the culture in the department that discouraged officers from speaking out against their colleagues. "I knew Walsh had issues," she told investigators, her voice heavy with regret. "Everyone knew. But there was this unspoken rule that you don't report on other officers. You don't make waves. I feel guilty now, wondering if I could have prevented this if I had been braver earlier." Her honesty earned her both criticism and praise. Some fellow officers viewed her testimony as betrayal, But many in the community saw her as someone trying to do the right thing, even if it came late. Chief Davidson made it clear that he valued her truthfulness and that there would be no retaliation for her cooperation with the investigation. As the legal process against Walsh moved forward, Chief Davidson began implementing immediate reforms in the department. He established a new civilian oversight committee with real power to review complaints. He revised use of force policies and made de-escalation training mandatory for all officers. He created an early warning system to flag officers who received multiple complaints, ensuring that patterns wouldn't be ignored anymore. And he began the difficult work of rebuilding trust with communities of color in Riverside. But perhaps the most significant development came when the state legislature announced hearings on police reform. Raymond was invited to testify, along with other victims of police misconduct, law enforcement officials, and civil rights advocates. The goal was to develop comprehensive legislation that would increase accountability and prevent incidents like Raymond's from happening again. Raymond spent hours preparing his testimony, working with legal advisors and advocacy groups. He knew that this was his opportunity to turn his personal experience into something that could help others. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the incident, giving him time to gather his thoughts and craft a message that would resonate. The state capitol building was packed on the day of the legislative hearing. The committee room, normally half empty during routine proceedings, now had every seat filled. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras ready. Citizens who had traveled from across Virginia sat waiting to hear testimony about police reform. And at the witness table sat Raymond Cole, wearing his Army dress uniform for the first time since the incident. He had debated whether to wear the uniform. Part of him felt that it shouldn't matter, that his experience as a civilian should carry the same weight as his identity as a general. But his wife Catherine had convinced him otherwise. "They need to see what Walsh refused to see," she said. "They need to understand the complete picture of what happened. Let them see the man who serves this country, so they can fully grasp how wrong it was." The committee chairman, a veteran legislator named Douglas Bennett, called the hearing to order. After some preliminary remarks about the importance of the proceedings, he invited Raymond to give his testimony. Raymond adjusted the microphone and looked out at the assembled crowd. He saw other victims of police misconduct sitting in the audience, their faces showing hope and pain. He saw active-duty soldiers who had come to support him. He saw activists who had been fighting for reform for years. And he saw ordinary citizens who simply wanted their police departments to serve everyone equally. "Thank you for inviting me to speak today," Raymond began, his voice steady and clear. 3 weeks ago, I was driving through Riverside, Virginia, on my way to visit my 87-year-old mother. I was pulled over without cause, verbally abused with racial slurs, and held at gunpoint while on my knees on the pavement. I was treated as a criminal despite having committed no crime, despite being completely cooperative, and despite showing identification proving who I was. He paused, letting that sink in. The officer who did this has been fired and charged with multiple crimes. And while I appreciate that accountability, my concern today isn't just about one officer. It's about the system that allowed him to behave that way for 15 years. It's about the 17 complaints that were filed against him and dismissed. It's about all the other victims who didn't have the platform I have to make their voices heard. For the next 20 minutes, Raymond shared his perspective not just as a victim, but as a leader who had spent decades thinking about accountability, training, and organizational culture. He talked about how the military handles misconduct, how they track patterns of behavior, how they remove people who pose dangers to others. He acknowledged that policing was difficult work, that officers faced genuine dangers and had to make split-second decisions. But he also emphasized that difficulty didn't excuse bigotry or abuse. "When I was a young lieutenant, I made mistakes," Raymond told the committee. "Every leader does. But I had commanders who held me accountable, who corrected my course, who didn't let those mistakes become patterns. That's what was missing in Officer Walsh's case. No one held him accountable until his behavior became so egregious that it couldn't be ignored anymore. And by then, he had left a trail of victims behind him." Other witnesses followed. Helen Nguyen, the neighbor who had recorded the incident, described what she saw and her decision to make the video public. Officer Chen testified about the culture of silence in the police department. Victims of Walsh's past misconduct shared their stories. some crying as they recalled their experiences. Legal experts discussed various policy options. Police chiefs from other departments described successful reform efforts they had implemented. The hearing lasted nearly 7 hours, and by the end, the committee members seemed genuinely moved and motivated to act. Chairman Bennett promised that comprehensive legislation would be drafted within 30 days. Meanwhile, Officer Walsh's criminal trial was scheduled to begin in 2 months. His attorney tried multiple tactics to get the charges dismissed or reduced, but the evidence was too strong. The video footage, the witness testimonies, the pattern of behavior documented in his file, everything pointed to guilt. Facing the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, Walsh eventually accepted a plea agreement. He pled guilty to civil rights violations and assault, receiving a sentence of 6 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 4. On the day of Walsh's sentencing, Raymond attended the hearing. He sat in the gallery, watching as Walsh stood before the judge. The man looked smaller somehow, diminished without his uniform and badge. When given the opportunity to speak, Walsh offered an apology that felt hollow and rehearsed. "I'm sorry for my actions," Walsh said, reading from a prepared statement. "I let my emotions get the better of me, and I failed to live up to the standards of law enforcement." Raymond noticed what was missing from the apology: any acknowledgement of racism, any recognition of the deeper issues at play, any genuine understanding of the harm he had caused. It was an apology designed to minimize and deflect, not to accept true responsibility. The judge, however, wasn't fooled. "Mr. Walsh," she said, her voice cold, "you had 17 opportunities to correct your behavior, 17 complaints over 15 years. Each one was a warning sign that you ignored. You violated the trust that communities place in police officers, and you endangered lives through your prejudice and aggression. This sentence reflects not just what you did to General Cole, but the pattern of abuse that you inflicted on countless citizens." As Walsh was led away in handcuffs, Raymond felt a complex mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but it felt incomplete. One officer was being punished, but how many others were still out there, still treating people unfairly, still hiding behind badges and blue walls of silence? The answer to that question began to emerge in the following months. The state legislature passed the Police Accountability and Reform Act, a comprehensive law that included mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent investigation of complaints, early warning systems for problematic behavior patterns, and civilian oversight boards with real authority. The law also banned certain aggressive tactics and required de-escalation training. Riverside's police department underwent particularly dramatic changes. Chief Davidson, true to his word, restructured the entire organization. He fired 2 other officers who had similar complaint histories. He hired new officers with diverse backgrounds and a commitment to community policing. He established regular town halls where citizens could voice concerns directly. And he created partnerships with community organizations to address underlying issues of trust and communication. Helen Nguyen, whose quick thinking and recording the incident had sparked everything, became an advocate for transparency. She worked with other residents to establish a local chapter of a police watchdog group, monitoring officer conduct and supporting victims of misconduct. Her courage inspired others to speak up and document issues rather than remain silent. Officer Chen took a different path. The experience had shaken her deeply, forcing her to confront her own complicity in a broken system. She left the Riverside Police Department and went back to school, eventually earning a degree in social work. She now works with at-risk youth, trying to prevent the kind of trauma and prejudice that creates both victims and perpetrators. For Raymond, the incident became a defining moment in his life, though not in the way he would have chosen. He completed his military service with distinction, but he also became a voice for justice and reform. He established the Cole Foundation for Police Accountability, which provided legal support to victims of police misconduct and funded research into best practices for law enforcement. He gave speeches at police academies, at civil rights conferences, and at military installations. He always told his story honestly, without exaggeration or dramatization, because the simple truth was powerful enough. And he always emphasized the same message, that his rank shouldn't have mattered, that every person deserved to be treated with dignity, and that real change required sustained effort and courage. 1 year after the incident, Raymond returned to Riverside for the dedication of a new community policing center. The building would house officers but also community programs, youth activities, and regular forums for dialogue between police and residents. Chief Davidson invited Raymond to cut the ribbon, and he accepted. Standing before a crowd that included many of the people who had witnessed or been affected by what happened on Oak Street, Raymond reflected on how much had changed and how much work remained. A year ago, something happened on a street not far from here that shouldn't happen to anyone in America, he said. It was painful, it was frightening, and it revealed deep problems that had been ignored for too long. But from that pain came action. From that injustice came a determination to do better. The reforms we've seen, in this town, in this state, and in communities across the country, they didn't happen automatically. They happened because people demanded them, because citizens spoke up, because good officers acknowledged problems and committed to fixing them. He looked at the new building, with its open design meant to be welcoming rather than fortress-like. This center represents a promise that law enforcement will serve all people equally, that complaints will be taken seriously, and that no one is above accountability. Will we always live up to that promise? Probably not perfectly, but we'll keep trying, keep improving, keep holding ourselves and each other to higher standards. That evening, Raymond visited his mother. She was doing well at 88, still living independently, still sharp and engaged with the world. They sat on her porch as the sun set, drinking sweet tea and talking about everything and nothing. "You've handled all this with such grace," his mother said. "I'm proud of you, Raymond. Not for being a general, but for being a good man who stood up for what's right." "I learned from you, Mama," he replied. "You always taught me that wrong was wrong, no matter who committed it. And that silence in the face of injustice made you part of the problem." She patted his hand. "I did teach you that, but you're the one who had the courage to live it, even when it was hard." As Raymond drove home that night, taking the same route he had traveled a year earlier, he thought about all the people whose lives had intersected with his on that hot afternoon. Helen with her camera and her courage, Officer Chen and her decision to tell the truth, Chief Davidson and his commitment to real reform, the victims of Walsh's past misconduct who had finally received acknowledgement and justice, and even Walsh himself now in prison, hopefully learning lessons he should have learned decades ago. Change never came easily or completely, Raymond knew. There would be setbacks and challenges ahead. But what happened on Oak Street had proven something important. That one incident, properly handled, could spark broader transformation. That accountability was possible. That justice, though sometimes delayed, could prevail. And most importantly, that ordinary people finding their courage in extraordinary moments could change the world.